Okay, thank you, Mark. Yeah, this isn't so much about what I'm doing, but maybe what I think we as a community should be doing. So I just want to start with this charge taken from the actual WSBO description itself and the kind of charge that was laid to us. And I think this really kind of like strikes home, resonates for a lot of us. You know, we're all, I think I speak for many of us when I say we're familiar with the pain caused by the need to do a lot of this kind of like mapping between these kind of like similar and not so similar kind of ontologies. And you know, as we all know, this really makes kind of like data integration expensive and cumbersome. So I thought this was a great description, but I also wanted to point out though that this problem is maybe not unique to ontologies, and in fact it predates the emergence of ontologies within the life sciences. Of course, the canonical example here is gene identifiers. So Michael Ashburner famously said something along the lines of bioinformaticians would rather share their toothbrushes than their gene identifiers. And this can be seen if we look at the different mappings available on these different kind of database pages, taking a particular human gene, such as the P53 gene. So you can see that there's identifiers in authoritative gene resources, such as NCBI Gene, OMIM, HGNC, Ensemble, as well as databases like Uniprot that essentially represent the kind of like the product of these genes. So you can see we've had this mapping problem for from a while in bioinformatics, and it's not just ontologies. And you might think, well, maybe this is where ontologies can be useful. They can come to our rescue, because after all, ontologies give us a database independent formalization of the actual underlying concept here. So ontologies to the rescue, or maybe not, because if we actually look in some existing ontologies and we do a search and say, okay, do we have any ontology representations of the P53 gene? Indeed we do, but the problem becomes compounded here, because all of a sudden we've got a proliferation of even more identifiers for genes. So you know, this is a variety of different kind of like ontologies here from Bioportal. Some of these maybe are not so much in wide use, but others, such as the Orphanet or rare disease ontology, certainly are. And you know, it goes even wider. If we look at kind of like things like UMLS or the NCIT Metathesaurus, you can see there's UMLS concept IDs and these kind of CDR code IDs for P53 as well. And even if we look in something like OLS, that gives you a more a search over a narrower set of ontologies, typically the ones within OBO, plus a kind of carefully selected set of ontologies that are useful in bioinformatics. We still see, you know, there's a lot of different P53s in our ontologies. And I tried to filter this so it's just the human P53 cases. I may not have done that successfully. I think maybe one of these is another species, but I think you get the point. There's a lot of P53s there in our ontologies, you know, and including ones, you know, the protein form of P53 in the protein ontology as well. So this isn't restricted just to genes as well. We can see this kind of like duality over a number of different database entities. You know, classically with kind of chemical entities, there are long-standing databases of drugs and chemical and small molecules drugs, such as Campbell, PubChem, Drug Bank. And then over on the side of ontologies, we've got OBO ontologies like KEBI, that itself is a bit of a kind of like dual database slash ontology that represents a subset of these entities, but again with different identifiers and different kind of like ways of slicing and dicing the world. And we can see this over, you know, a number of other entity types. We'll hear about reactions and cell lines and so on later today. But this is really just to make the point that the synergization problem is not just ontologies. It exists with these database entities. And it's made more complex by the fact that we've got these dual database representations and ontology representations of these entities too. So what I wanted to do was maybe kind of like propose a set of rules or design patterns for how we might essentially ontologize which is a bit of a fancy word, but essentially take some of these entities from these databases, such as chemical entity databases, and make some kind of like representation as an ontology, such that we can use things like kind of like text mining tools. We can use it in our ontology axiomatizations and so on. So so the first rule here is really just don't. So don't bother ontologizing. So I think that maybe concludes my talk. I'll take any questions now. But yeah, in fact not. But if you really must mint IDs, if you really must kind of create an ontology representation of your database entities, then I propose as a rule that we don't mint new IDs for these, but we essentially use the same IDs for these same concepts, and we reuse IDs from existing databases. And in doing this, we help to at least tame the notorious mapping problem, in that we're not proliferating new identifiers as well. And then a more nuanced kind of approach would be to essentially take this approach of conflating rather than proliferating. Now, those of us who kind of like work in ontologies know that ontologists love to split rather than to lump. We like to kind of like subdivide concepts in all manner of different ways, which provides a nice excuse for making new ontologies for things, but maybe sometimes we don't need to do that all the time. And there's actually a really nice paper by Stefan Schultz, who's worked in this domain for a long time, which is focused on disease representations, but I think is applicable to a number of other kinds of entities as well. And it's got some nice patterns in there for how we might conflate entities such that we don't end up kind of proliferating new IDs for the same concepts again and again. And I would also propose that we use direct automated translations where possible. And this helps us really be very, very clear about where the actual kind of content development and curation happens. So curation should really happen in the upstream database, because after all, these people are the actual authorities themselves, and we should work collaboratively with these resources rather than make essentially a semi-competing kind of ontology representation of a database. And the other rule would be to keep it simple. Don't try and get too clever. Don't try and over-ontologize when you make an ontology representation of this. Don't bring in too many kind of unintended ontological commitments, because then this restricts the ability to reuse your ontology for other purposes. And then you'll inevitably lead to a situation whereby someone will just want to create a new ontology and start the whole thing all over again. And try not to introduce your own classifications, and simply use the entities from the databases directly. So some of that, oh, and finally, I think another really useful paper I'd recommend to really everyone in the field on the limits of OWL and ontologies, in particular when trying to kind of like use ontologies to represent not just a simple classification, but to represent, all of the knowledge we may have about a particular domain. So I highly recommend this paper by Stefan Schultz, Alan Rector, Al Solberg et al. So let me try and kind of like make some of these a bit more concrete. One example is the NCBI Taxon ontology representation. So what we did here a number of years ago is that we needed to use taxon IDs as ontologies. So rather than kind of creating our own ontology de novo, we essentially did a direct translation using kind of like hopefully quite simple Python code that takes the database representation from NCBI and turns it into a simple ontology structure. We reused the IDs from NCBI Taxon. We just did a direct translation. We didn't introduce our own classification. So this means, maybe some things within the NCBI taxonomy don't quite make sense for an OBO classification, but we decided to just keep it simple and do a direct translation. Although there are some nuances there. You're essentially able to bring in your own layers. So you can bring in your own kind of grouping classes for prokaryotes and so on that aren't actually in the classification itself. And we don't really try and over-ontologize this, although it's maybe tempting. We just take the classification as it is. So maybe a counterexample here is SNOMED has its own taxonomy in there, and rather than it being a direct translation of an authoritative resource, they've essentially, I believe, kind of curated their own one here. So it's making its own IDs. It's not a direct translation. Introduces additional classifications of things like monkey and fish that you won't find in NCBI taxonomy because they're not monophyletic groupings. But it's at least a simple hierarchy. Another example is an ontology that we've been, I say working on, but again, the key point here is that this is a simple direct translation. In this case of the representation of chromosome bands within UCSC. And the use case here is we frequently need to be able to reference, have stable IDs to reference whole chromosomes in individual organisms, or chromosome arms or bands or band ranges within chromosomes. And there's actually not really a kind of like a standard system for be able to kind of like represent these as kind of like numeric style identifiers. So when we create this ontology, we essentially do a direct translation of the UCSC band data. And we opted to make kind of IDs that were not kind of oboe-like, but instead just represented the standard chromosome kind of nomenclature. So 1p11.1 and so on. But again, it's a direct translation. We don't try and kind of introduce our own kind of ontologization on top of that. And it's a, essentially ends up being a simple part of hierarchy. So a more nuanced case is in the case of pathway database representations. So this table kind of gives you a sense of some of the different ontologies that can be used to classify either signaling pathways, biochemical pathways, or the elements of biochemical pathways, such as reactions and chemical entities. And on the right, we see all of the different kind of like databases that will either have pathway representations or associate genes with pathways. So on the ontologies itself, we're working on a mapping of the pathway ontology to the gene ontology, which at least to the signaling and metabolic parts of the pathway ontology. So, and we're also doing similar things with mapping reactions and so on, and you'll hear that in Jim's talk later on. But a more challenging problem is synergizing the pathway data itself, and this is a notoriously hard problem. You know, there's a standard exchange format for pathways called BioPax. It's an OWL representation, but various papers have shown this is insufficient for kind of like doing integration. So we tried an approach where we made use of ontologies to integrate some of this pathway data. We used a formalism called GoCham, causal activity models, which is an OWL formalism that we're using in the Go for representing gene product to GoTerm associations in a way that allows us to represent causal relationships between those genes. And our general approach here was to treat the pathway database entities as instances of ontology classes. So this is a different synergization pattern, and we prototyped this using Reactome. So I don't really have time to kind of go into the details, but there's a paper here came out this year in bioinformatics that describes some of the methodology of mapping from BioPax OWL into this GoCham OWL representation. But the key point here is that this is using an instantiation pattern. And one thing I'd like to mention that as a side effect of some of this work in representing instance-based pathway representations using ontologies is that we essentially needed classes to be able to represent genes, proteins, non-coding RNAs, complexes from any species using native identifiers. So according to the authoritative database, which may be a model organism database like ZFIN, or it may be a protein database like UniProt. And we actually needed to use these IDs interchangeably. Again, so we're using the kind of like the Schultz conflation pattern here. And so our approach here was to create an ontology called NEO, the Noctua Entity Ontology, making use of identifier.org's pearls and essentially doing a direct automated translation from the authoritative databases, the model organism databases, such as ZFIN and UniProt and so on. And we actually followed a similar pattern for translating Reactome entities. So Reactome has its own identifiers for genes and proteins in specific contexts, chemical entities. So we created a translation of this called Reacto as well. So the details of this are in the paper. So to conclude, the synergization problem is not unique to ontologies. Ontologies can potentially help, but they can also make this situation worse. not better, with the proliferation of additional IDs that need to be mapped. So I think we as a community need better rules and guidelines and design patterns for being able to essentially synergize ontologies with these database entities. We haven't necessarily agreed as a community what these rules are yet, but I'm proposing at least a beginning set of patterns, involving things like direct translation. It's worth bearing in mind, we may not need an ontology for these things at all, but in the use cases that do demand it, maybe there's some better ways of doing things. I think what we also need as a community is just better formal evaluation of the different ways in which we do this task. And I think we're really only just kind of like scratching the surface so far. And so I really invite everyone to kind of like join the ongoing discussion here. If there is an OBO Slack workspace, everyone's welcome to, and we have a channel here, Databases as Ontologies, that I'd like you to join. And with that, I will take any questions.
That was great, Chris. I guess I have to ask the obvious question is if we develop these kinds of rules that would allow us to describe things in a more uniform way and avoid the duplication and the confusion, how do we enforce them?
I mean, I don't know. I guess I would take maybe more like the kind of the OBO approach there and say, we're not necessarily here to enforce these, but there's a group of us that are at least interested in doing this. And then let's consolidate around that group. And then let's just try and do, as good a job we can within that group. And at least maybe we won't have kind of solved the proliferation problem entirely, but we'll at least have coalesced the community around, maybe a kind of like a core canonical representation.
Okay. Those questions are now appearing in the chat, which is great. Let's see. How are you dealing with the different levels of hierarchy in ontologies and databases such as Ensemble, HGNC, and Entree?
Okay, good point. So I would say that maybe we don't need to do that. So I would propose essentially a direct translation where you don't try and kind of create, where sometimes like fake grouping classes to try and make something look like an ontology. I think there's some kind of like deeper kind of like questions I didn't really have time to get into here about exactly what it means to be an ontology and when do we need a kind of an ontology based representation, and should we try and make everything look the same way. But there is a kind of like a longer version of this talk that I gave to the OBO group a while ago, and I go into some of the details there. But essentially I would say don't try and necessarily make a hierarchy for these things. These things, Ensemble, HGNC, and so on, they all have kind of like annotations to various other ontology terms. Simply just use those for the classification and don't introduce a new one.
Okay, there's a request actually for that OBO talk. If there's any kind of a link, please put it in the chat later so people can follow up on that.
I will do. Mm-hmm.
And Matthew Horridge wants to know, do you have any rules of thumb for for recognizing when you're over ontologizing?
I do. I'm not sure I can summarize them very quickly right now, but I'd be happy to expand on those later. But,